And start from right here. We are going to be picking up where we started, basically talking about the civil rights movement under Lyndon Baines Johnson. And here is your first slide of a couple civil rights movement slides. You are writing, this is going to be the march from the famous Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. The goal of this march, and remember, Martin Luther King Jr., his entire idea is passive resistance, making it to where you are asking for your rights, but you are doing so in somewhat of a demanding fashion. However, it is very passive the way he goes about it. We talked about the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s with Rosa Parks. We've talked about the sit-ins that are going to be starting and will continue to go through the 1960s. We've talked about the march from the South up to Washington, D.C., where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. But this march goes down in history as one of the most effective marches, and it is civil disobedience. March 3rd, 1965, first march was actually unsuccessful. They will go a second time. In fact, the second time they go, March 7th, 1965, it will be successful and it'll become a national movement. You can see this picture right here. We march with Selma. This was actually in Harlem, New York City, 1965. The March 15th, Presidential Voting Rights Act was being introduced in 1965. And these marches were in basically the goal of them was to raise awareness for that voting rights. And one question I have for you on your notes is, why is it important for blacks to be able to vote? I mean, you want civil rights, you should just treat them right? You shouldn't have to, they don't have to be able to vote. But wait a second, if they don't vote, they don't choose somebody that will demonstrate and represent their interests. So for African Americans to achieve social equality, political equality is absolutely necessary. And what were the names of the laws that were taking and basically keeping them away from the voting rights polls? Jim Crow laws, right? They were stopping African Americans in tons of different ways. And we have talked many times about examples of civil disobedience. I mean, I put on your notes, list 4 examples. We talked about the boycotts, yes? Bus boycott in particular. We talked about sit-ins. We're going to talk about marches. I know, of course, there was the one where they went and they rode down into the South to basically test a law saying that African Americans and whites can't ride on a bus together. What do we call those people? The riders, the Freedom Riders. And JFK and his brother Bobby ended up sending in troops for that. These marches are going to be another form of civil disobedience. Now, this march right here is going to be, again, from Selma to Montgomery. This will happen March 21st, 1965. Led a second march Martin Luther King Jr. did, and this is going to be where President Johnson sends in the National Guard to protect the marchers again because they were met with violence. I texted you guys a little bit about, this is the anniversary of the Selma march. This march is successful in not only raising awareness for the Voting Rights Act that LBJ is going to pass, but it's also successful in registering 3,200 African Americans to vote. And in 1965, when President Johnson signs into law the Voting Rights Act, it will be possibly the most important legislation, civil rights legislation in American history, because African Americans can't obtain civil rights if they can't vote for representatives who will obtain those civil rights through legislation. It's going to be very important to note that. Now, the other one that's going to be important to note before I get too far ahead of myself is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right here. Go ahead and big old highlight, big old circle right here. Again, it's going to be about voting. It abolishes the use of voter registration or a literacy requirement. You might want to underline literacy requirement. Do y'all remember what laws are talking that about? Jim Crow laws. It's also going to eliminate the employment discrimination based on race in all jobs, not just government jobs like JFK did with that Committee on Equal Opportunity Employment. The next thing that's going to happen under LBJ, this is a massive win as well, an amendment to the Constitution? Yeah, I think so. In fact, Johnson gets what he wants. In fact, there's something we're going to call the Johnson treatment. Johnson is an extremely effective politician, and when he goes into the presidency, I'll be honest with you, he is almost just as good, if not better, than JFK. He actually gets through and asks for for civil rights, a ban on the poll tax, another Jim Crow law that had been reminiscent. And with that, the 24th Amendment will be ratified. Super important. And then there was, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banning literacy tests in counties where over half the eligible voters had been disenfranchised. And remember, disenfranchised means to have had their ability to vote taken away from them. Remember, to enfranchise is to grant suffrage. In other words, to be able to vote. To disenfranchise is to take it away. This picture right up here, I think, is really symbolic. Here is President Johnson meeting with MLK discussing civil rights. And there is a lot of people that are going to see this, and they are going to say, oh my gosh, Johnson is letting African Americans into the Oval Office. Yes, and he's also listening to them. LBJ was one of the biggest supporters of civil rights during this century. And it is such a shame that his domestic and civil rights policy will be basically overshadowed by the Vietnam War. But definitely going to be important to know that he was a big supporter. But remember, he was a teacher to those Hispanic kids down in Texas. He thinks that minorities should have tons of opportunities, and he thinks that there is nothing that should stop them. And that's why he's one of my favorite domestic presidents. Now, I will tell you, this is going to be an add-in. Make sure you know Thurgood Marshall is appointed by LBJ to SCOTUS. We've already kind of talked about him. He was, of course, the lawyer with Brown versus Board of Education. He was appointed by to SCOTUS by LBJ. It's a significant moment because not only is the civil rights movement happening, but now we have an African American on the highest court of the land. Pretty dang impressive, Thurgood Marshall. Now, here is somebody I'm sure you've all heard of, so let's go ahead and pause it, get it down. Malcolm X. We talk about a lot of civil rights leaders, and some are radical, some are passive, some have different approaches, some, we only spent a second on, Marcus Garvey, but literally we look at all of them. Malcolm X, born in Omaha, Nebraska, he was actually called Malcolm Little, was the son of a Baptist preacher who urged blacks to stand up for their rights. His father was killed by a white supremacist in Michigan in 1931, very beginning of the Great Depression. The saddest thing in the world is how one act of violence can turn someone violent. Ultimately, the saddest thing, but I'll be honest, if I were Malcolm X and I lived the life he'd led, I might have been angry too. Malcolm X goes down in history as one of the more radical and violent civil rights movement leaders in American history. He had moved to Harlem where he'd become involved in a lot of bad things, gambling, drugs, robbery. Malcolm was arrested at the age of 20 for armed robbery, and in jail he studied the teaching of Elijah Muhammad and converted to Islam. His critics accused him of teaching racism, but black supremacy-style racism, and also anti-Semitism. But Malcolm X is 100% one of the more radical beings in this time period. You guys don't have this slide, but let me give you a little bit of what Malcolm X is about. Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. So far, so good. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. Nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. You can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. He's got a couple really, really good points. But Malcolm X is going to be the complete opposite of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., passive, civil disobedience, standing up, but making sure that you stand up in the right way. Malcolm X, very radical, advocates violence if needed. Again, I can understand why he'd be violent sometimes, but definitely different. Going to be Islamic, that's going to put a definite interesting twist on it. Little quiz question, maybe possibly. He was assassinated in Harlem, shot on the streets of Harlem when he was giving a speech. A lot of people in the 1960s, especially towards the end of it, they're going to get angry because while the civil rights movement is progressing, it might not be progressing as fast as they would like it, and some are going to turn to violence. Malcolm X is going to be one of the top symbols for violence during that time. Other group, Black Panthers. Let me let you pause this and get it down. Okay, I hope you paused it and got it down because there's a lot we're going to talk about here. First and foremost is probably going to be the best line in Forrest Gump ever. When we watch it in class, you better believe I'm going to rewind it and let it play like 3 times. I'm sorry I had to fight in the middle of the Black Panther Party. If you've seen that movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you will all see it soon. Black Panthers. I want you to make sure you write out beside this slide a couple words, and I'm going to be checking when I check your notes. First one's radical in capital letters. Radical. Next one, violent. Violent. The Black Panther Party is a U.S. African American militant group founded in 1966 in Oakland, California, led by, I need you to make sure you highlight or circle their names right here, Huey P. Newton and this guy named Bobby Seale. They believed in a violent revolution, and there was only one way to receive freedom, and that is to take it. Do you see how they possibly saw Malcolm X as somewhat of their ally? They urged African Americans to arm themselves. Circle that arm. Of course, that means carry a gun. Take a look at some of these pictures right here. All of them carrying guns. In the late 1960s, party leaders got involved with violent confrontations with the police. Huey P. Newton actually was tried in 1967 for killing a police officer. The Black Panther Party is going to definitely be one of the most radical, violent civil rights movement groups that there is. They are going to definitely be on the opposite side of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say, don't do what they're doing because you're giving into the stereotype that African Americans are less than. The Black Panther Party, however, did get a lot of groundhold, especially towards the late 1960s, because the civil rights movement is not perfect, and there were still obstacles in its way. But definitely something to know about the diverse number of groups in the civil rights. Here's a quiz yourself. Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated. You see the answer? Literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting. Political views of. Supported. Civil disobedience, nonviolent, desegregation, opposed. Violence. Political compromises. Racial separatism. That's also something else the Black Panthers wanted. Which name of the civil rights leader? Booker T. Martin Luther King. Stokely Carmichael. We're learning him after spring break, so it's not going to be that one. Or Malcolm X. Supported civil disobedience. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Now, if you swapped this, then it would be probably Malcolm X. Which government poster is directly related to the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Employment discrimination is illegal. A student learning in U.S. history is instructed to write a paper about Du Bois and race relations in the U.S. Which of the following would be most relevant to the student's assignment? Race relations about W.E.B. Du Bois. What do you think? What has to do with Du Bois down here? That one might be on a quiz, so you might want to think about that. Okay, tune in for the next video. It's going to be all Vietnam from here on out.